Okay, hi everybody. This is our uh, recording for our chapter 6 of our EDUC 2301 exceptional learners, exceptional populations course. And I have a guest tonight. He is an expert in our topic. He's also my husband. So this is the other Dr. Cavan who helped me a little bit earlier in this semester. Some of you all have corresponded with him. So this is Dr. Clark Cavan, and he's done some adjunct faculty work at Tarleton. He's also done some adjunct faculty work at TCU and Texas Woman's and UNT. So he's a seasoned professor as well as me. And he is an expert in emotional and behavioral disorders. And so whenever I have this topic, I like to kind of defer to his expertise. We actually met in the doctoral program at the University of North Texas about 25 years ago or so, when we were both working on our doctorates there. And my area of expertise was evaluation, identifying disabilities. And his area of expertise was emotional and behavioral disorders. And so we fell in love over special education. Doesn't that sound romantic? And so we've been married almost 22 years. And so it's been an interesting time of being together where we can share this this topic that we both care a lot about. He's had an interesting career in education, in special education, and in general education. He's been not only has he been a part-time professor, he's been a full-time campus administrator. He's been a teacher in a special education classroom that was designed just for kids with emotional and behavioral disorders, which we'll talk about tonight. Then he's been a principal and an assistant principal in the interim. And currently he's back as a behavior expert. And he's working with the Parker County Special Education Co-op as their behavior expert. And he's going around to the 5 different campuses, 5 different school districts rather, with a bunch more campuses than that in their special education shared service arrangement and consulting with each of those school districts. And these are the smaller towns in Parker County out past Weatherford. So that's Poolville and Peaster and Brock and Millsap, and I'm forgetting one, Garner. And working with those districts to help them with their students that have these particular kinds of disabilities that we're talking about tonight, and some other disabilities that kind of bleed over into the realm of behavior and emotional problems. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about some of that tonight because he's got some interesting insights into that. But we'll go ahead and get started. I want to say a couple of things kind of as general announcements to people. I've had some emails in the last week from students who are having varying issues with their field experience. So I just wanted to address a few of those. If you have contacted me, just know that I'm working on all of those. Lindsay, I have an email and a voicemail out to the certification office about your situation in Glen Rose, trying to get that worked out so that you can have all of those at the same campus. Samantha is in Japan, and we're trying to work that out as well. I have a call in for you. Bailey, I've got a call in for you to get your assignment. And Haley, I've got a call in for you to see if we can get you with all of your assignments in the same district as well. So if you have another issue related to your field experience, shoot me an email or give me a call or send me a text or whatever works for you. And we'll see if we can get that worked out. On my list, I think I have just a few of you. I think there's five or six of you who are not education majors who were responsible for getting your own assignments. And Hannah, I think you're one of those, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Just let me know.
Yeah, I found mine though.
Okay, good. And I think there's maybe five of you girls that have maybe your child and family studies majors who are responsible for getting your own, unfortunately, because of the way things are divvied up right now. But y'all are good about taking care of business in your department. And so I think that's working out. But I just want to make sure that everybody's taken care of. And so I'm going to send an email. Hannah, I won't send you one because we've just now spoken, but I'll send one to each of the other girls that I think that applies to, and just make sure that we've got everybody covered. So we'll go ahead and get started then with our PowerPoint, and I'll do some of the talking, and I'll let the other Dr. Cavan do the rest, and we'll kind of tag team through this next part. So I'm going to go to my share screen, and here we go. And when we're done tonight, of course, I'll do what I always do and post the webinar and the slideshow. So all of our disabilities that we're talking about this semester have their roots in IDEA, and that's our Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that has most recently been updated in 2004. And what you see on your screen right now is the formal definition in IDEA, that federal law that tells us what each disability is, how it's formalized in the law. And this is the definition for emotional disability. And this is where things are a little bit tricky with this particular disability, because behavioral disorders are not actually part of the formal definition that that we have in federal law. But kids with behavior problems are certainly a problem in our schools. And so we're going to talk about that and how that all weaves together tonight in our discussion. And I'll let the other Dr. Cavan talk about some of that. Because like I say, this is his area of specialization. But this is what the law says in its definition of emotional disability. It's a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects a child's educational performance. An inability to learn, which cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. An inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. There's a little bit more on the next slide, but before I move to the next slide, I want you to notice there in the first bullet, characteristics that are demonstrated over a long period of time and to a marked degree. Now, a long period of time. How long is a long period of time? Well, it depends. A long period of time can be varying according to who you are and what you think a long period of time is.
If you're holding your breath, 60 seconds can be a long period of time.
That's right. And yeah, exactly. And in other situations, 60 seconds is nothing.
Okay.
And what's a marked degree? What's to a marked degree? Well, that's about as fuzzy as anything you could possibly put into words. A marked degree. What does marked even mean? To a marked degree? Who knows? But that's the way the federal law describes it. Can't you tell that this was written by lawmakers? This sounds so fuzzy that I know lawmakers wrote this. It just has all the earmarks of lawmakers. You can tell that this was put together by people who didn't really want you to know exactly what they were talking about. So,
And in the next bullet, they're basically ruling out low intellect. They're ruling out sensory, and by that they mean blindness, deafness, those kinds of things.
yeah,
And then health factors, but are they really ruling that out? What if the health factor is an emotional disturbance? So
fuzzy, very fuzzy definition. Here the definition continues. It can also be a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. So depression qualifies. Or a tendency to develop physical symptoms.
only if it's marked depression over a long period of time.
That's right.
How long is that?
I don't know. Or fears associated with personal or school problems. So physical symptoms, but didn't it say something about health on the page before this?
Right.
Okay. So emotional disturbance can include schizophrenia, but the term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it's determined that they have an emotional disturbance.
So you can't be emotionally disturbed if you're socially maladjusted, unless the social maladjustment is because you have an emotional disturbance.
Okay, this is just too confusing, isn't it?
Cleared it right up for you.
Okay. Now, who can make this determination? Can teachers decide? Can diagnosticians decide? Who makes this decision? There's only one person who can make this decision. Well, that's not actually true. There's one person generally who makes this decision on a school campus, and that's the school psychologist. Educational diagnosticians don't have the qualifications for this, and that's people like me in the schools. Teachers certainly don't. Principals don't. School counselors don't.
Behavior specialist does not.
Behavior specialists don't. A person with a master's degree or a doctoral degree in school psychology can make this determination. Now, from an outside source, a psychiatrist or a psychologist can make this diagnosis. A medical doctor cannot. Certainly a parent recommendation doesn't get this for you. Only a person with a degree in psychology at the master's or doctoral level, or a person with an MD in psychiatry can make this diagnosis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk a little bit now then about an alternative definition. Some states, not our state, but some states have this broader definition where they include behavior disabilities, behavior disorders in this category. And I think that's why our chapter is called Emotional and Behavior Disorders, because there's a lot of places that kind of lump all these together. So there are 2 YouTube videos that we're not going to take time to watch right now, but you can get to them through this this PowerPoint later. And they look at the 2 types of classifications that I have listed here at the bottom of the page. What we call internalizing behaviors or externalizing behaviors. And your book talks about this primarily in reference to the way girls tend to behave with emotional disturbance and the way boys tend to behave with emotional disturbance. Girls tend toward the internalizing behaviors where all of it turns inward through manifestations of anxiety or depression, all things that work inward. And boys tend, not always, but tend to have externalizing behaviors, that more the acting out, antisocial behaviors or aggression. And sometimes we make more of a mental hook here so we can remember it better, to say that internalizing behaviors are more of the disturbed behaviors, where externalizing behaviors are disturbing. So how do you want to talk about this part a little bit?
Well, I think it's important that we realize that when we talk about emotional and behavioral disorder, a lot of times in academia, we will make that EDBD, emotionally disturbed behavior disorder, put a slash in there. In fact, the first course I ever had on this way back when, my professor kept talking about EDBD kids. And I was like, itty bitty kids, what's the problem? You just pick them up, move them wherever you want to move them. They're, they're itty bitty kids, move them around, but it's EDBD. And as she said, we don't have that in Texas. But when I talk about the job that I do, I talk of myself as a behavior specialist. I can't do anything about the emotional disorder. Normally, that's handled with medication and that kind of thing. But I do address the behaviors. So we very much handle this, but we don't even have behavior as part of our definition in Texas. As far as the disturbed and the disturbing, I don't think I've ever seen that before, but it makes sense. But you wouldn't ever want to say that kid is emotionally disturbing. That would be a pejorative type term. And I think I'd be careful with that.
Yeah, and that's something that we would just talk about among ourselves as educators, not to families or anybody else. But that's a way to kind of have a mental hook on the way we view it.
Yeah, kind of reminds me of a T-shirt I have that says, I don't think he's suffering from a behavior disorder. I think he's enjoying it. Because sometimes you get these kids that seem to really relish the fact that they can get by with a lot because of their behavior problems.
Well, and Dr. Cavan here is working right now, has been with a child in one of his districts that is very much on the, well, I was about to say very much on the disturbing end of things, but he's also pretty disturbed.
Mhm.
But a lot of those externalizing behaviors, a lot of aggression. And in fact, how would you describe, last week even turned that very much toward Clark here, and threw furniture at him, and did a lot of swearing.
Hit me with a chair.
Yeah, hit him with a chair, threw furniture, threw a number of items in the classroom.
Took the charging block from his Chromebook on the cord and was swinging it around like a nunchuck or something and trying to hit me with that. And he's got a lot of issues. He's very much with where you see the externalizing behavior, but he would rather stick to the internalizing behavior. If you just leave him alone, he will be anxious and he will be depressed and he will sleep. But when you start pushing him, trying to get work out of him, then these externalizing behaviors come out. And as Lisa said, that a lot of times you think about the internalizing behaviors being with the females and the externalizing being with the males. And we're going to talk about the prevalence and the identification a little bit in a little while. But most of the time, the kids that we're working with are males. And most of the time, they're kids who are exhibiting these externalizing behaviors. You can have a female who has these internalizing behaviors, and they're not really causing a problem in the school. They may not be getting a lot out of it because they're sitting in the back and they're so anxious and they sit by themselves at lunch and all that kind of thing, not able to build relationships like the definition talked about. But it's not always that way. One of the first girls that I had in one of my classes many years ago, my first teaching job, I was in Fort Worth ISD. They had about 70,000 kids at that time, and they took the 10 worst special ed kids and shipped them to one campus. They took them from all over the city and shipped them to one campus, to one classroom, and that was my classroom. And I got 2 girls in there that first year, and we'll just call the one I'm talking about Rhonda. And Rhonda got in there, and I heard, why do we have a girl? What's her deal? Well, I found out her deal was grand theft auto. I mean, in middle school, she had stolen a car and was in all kinds of trouble with the law. And at her middle school, she was often seen trying to take boys out of the school into, they'd try to find an unlocked parked car in the parking lot and goes from there. So very much some externalizing behaviors that were going on with this girl. And you will sometimes see boys that have the internalizing behavior, but generally speaking, it's the boys are more likely to have the more antisocial and aggressive behaviors.
Well, and in my last school district, we had a behavior unit at one of our elementary schools. And we had, it was all boys except for one girl. And she was we had kindergarten through sixth grade in that district. And she was a sixth grader. So our oldest elementary age student. And she was a registered sex offender. She had repeatedly raped her younger brother, and therefore came to us with a sex offender label. Very sexually inappropriate, very sexually aggressive. And we were under a court order to have her escorted at all moments of the day. She had to have an adult with her every minute, going to the bathroom, coming back, lunch outside, anytime she was at the school, she had to have someone with her, because of course, you're not supposed to have a sex offender near a school. She was in the school by virtue of the fact that she was a child and was entitled to an education. And so we had to protect all of the other children from her. We had a lot of very irate parents when they realized, through the grapevine, some of what was going on that year. But she was entitled to an education as well, but certainly an externalizing behavior from that student.
But that does bring up, a lot of people, even my granddad, he grew up in a time when they had reform schools. And when I would tell him about some of my students, he's like, well, why aren't they in reform school? They don't have reform schools. There actually was a Supreme Court case called Honig versus Doe that made the ruling that a child cannot act bad enough to give up their right to an education. So whatever their behavior is, you may be able to remove them for up to 45 days. The kid that I've been working with threatened to bring a gun to school and kill everybody. They went to his house, found out there is a gun there in the house. And so part of why I'm working with him, and he's not at the regular campus, is because he was found guilty of making a terroristic threat. But that doesn't cost him his right to an education. He still has the right, according to law, to be educated, free appropriate public education at public expense in the least restrictive environment appropriate for him. So like it or not, these kids are in the schools. And one thing that I'm big on is we need to teach teachers how to deal with them. Otherwise, we end up running off the teachers because they don't know how to handle the kids. So
it's true. Okay, we'll move on from here. So these are some facts that you'll find in your textbook, but we'll talk about them for just a moment. Prevalence in this disability category is kind of debatable. Generally speaking, it's assumed that there's about 2% of our special education population that's found in this category, but there's a lot of discussion that it's probably much higher than that. Some think maybe more like 3 to 6%. Some think it's really much higher than that. There are probably a lot of kids who go undiagnosed, who are out there, and like Clark said a minute ago, kids who perhaps are those females who are internalizing and we never identify because they're sitting quietly at the back of the room, maybe just chewing their nails and picking at their skin, or other kinds of antisocial sorts of behaviors, self-harm kinds of things, but that go unnoticed by people in the school who would ordinarily make a special education referral. Gender factors, as you might guess, boys tend to be referred for special education in these categories more often than females. I would say purely because of the externalizing factors that are more noticeable. We tend to take note as educators. We tend to take note of kids who are disturbing, those that get in the way of our lessons and the order of our classrooms. And so when we've got somebody that disrupts and interrupts the flow of things, we take note and we try to remove them from our classroom. And sometimes special education is the fastest and easiest way to do that. So oftentimes that's males for those kinds of activities that get in the way of education. Age factors, the numbers get larger and larger the older kids get. We tend not to want to smack this label onto very young children. You won't find too many psychologists that want to put an emotional disturbance label on a very young child. Most of them want to give the benefit of the doubt to younger children, that it's a maturational issue, that they'll grow out of some of these things, or they'll get more mature, and some of these negative behaviors will disappear, that they'll grow into their emotions, that kind of thing. There's also a lot of baggage that comes along with this label for the family. This is the only disability category that we find ourselves blaming the family for. You can't blame the family for having a child with a learning disability or an intellectual disability or a traumatic brain injury, unless, of course, it was inflicted by the family, for blindness or deafness or an orthopedic impairment or any of the other disabilities that we have on our list. But this one, if a child has been badly abused, either psychologically or physically or other kinds of ways, sexually, we can certainly blame the people that had a hand in that. And so families are very reluctant to have this label placed on their children as well. So we don't usually see this in very young children, but as kids get older and they begin to act out more or internalize more, we're more likely to assign this label to students. We're able to get more information about what might be contributing to it. And as kids get older, we find this label to be more utilized in schools. Socioeconomic factors, like it or not, this is a disability category that is more commonly found amongst the poor. And so we do see it more readily in communities that have poverty. And like it or not as well, it is also a disability that we find more frequently in communities of color. Not exclusively by any stretch. These disabilities are no respecters of persons across ethnic and racial lines, but we'll find people with these disabilities in every ethnic group, every socioeconomic group, but there is a greater number, proportionally speaking, amongst the poor and amongst those communities of color. You want to add to anything here?
Was it, I think it was 1990, where in the reauthorization of IDEA, they took autism out from under the emotional disturbance.
Autism became its own category.
It became its own category. I'm looking at numbers from the latest ones I could find real off the top of my head, 2015, 2016, and emotional disturbance is 6% of our special ed kids, while autism is 11%. So you're looking at 18% roughly, 17-18%. When you put those two together, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because a lot of times you have behaviors from kids who are labeled as autistic. So you might a kid I'm working with in one of the districts right now. He is very autistic. I know you're autistic or not, no, not very, but he is definitely has autism, and but has some acting out behaviors. He's virtually nonverbal. He does make some noises that once you get to know him, you can kind of make out some of what he's saying, but pretty low functioning kid. He's not a kid that you would find in a mainstream classroom ordinarily, but he definitely has some acting out behaviors that are problematic, in that he scares the other kids and he's knocked the teacher down a time or two and that sort of thing. Normally, our kids with emotional disturbances are the highest IQ of any of the disability categories, which is ironic because they also have the worst outcomes of any of the disability categories. Even kids who are labeled as intellectually disabled have better outcomes than our kids who have emotional behavior disorders as they become adults. They can't hold a job. Most of losing a job has to do with your behavior and how you get along with your coworkers and all that sort of thing. Had a kid named Mike that when I was in the high school program, we would help kids get jobs, and he got a job at a factory, and his job was simply, as the whatever it was came down the line to him, he was to push a button. And he decided that he would rather sit back in the chair and push the button with his foot rather than push the button with his finger. So the supervisor saw him doing this and told him, you have to push the button with your finger. And he, grumbled, as he always did in class when you told him to do something. And this continued to happen. And he got caught 2 or 3 times pushing it with his foot rather than his finger. And they told him that they were going to fire him. So he jumped up and took the chair he was sitting in and began to beat the machine and did thousands of dollars worth of damage to the assembly line, plus all the time that they lost having to repair it because he wanted to push a button with his foot rather than his finger. So hard for a kid like that to keep his job.
Wow. Okay, let's talk a little bit about causes. Lots of causes here. As we've talked about a little bit, they can be environmental. They can be things that are caused by the family, by the community, by the school itself. So, influences that are going on at home, like I talked about, abuse, maybe bullying or other things that are going on in the community, maybe the impact of those that are surrounding the student in the community. I had a student in my last school district who was a refugee from I think it was Somalia, one of the countries in Eastern Africa. And he had been in a refugee camp for several years before he came to the US. And he had seen all kinds of horrific things in the refugee camp. He had seen the murder of his father in the refugee camp. And if that wasn't bad enough, once he got to the US, he and his mother moved into an apartment complex that had quite a bit of gang activity going on. And he was only in upper elementary school at the time, but he got associated with some of the gang members. And so I think some of the trauma that he had seen had caused him to form a really hard outer shell. And he had seen crime while he was still living in Africa. And then when he got to the US, he used that hard shell to kind of make his way with these older boys. And it caused him to really have a lot lot He began acting out in really serious ways. He got a record with the local criminal authorities for petty crimes that he committed in the neighborhood. And then things just kind of spiraled out of control from there. one day he was acting out at the school, and the mother was called to come and get him, and she was taken away from her job to come and get him. And when she got there to the school, he had already been apprehended. He had run from the school, and the police got him in the neighborhood and brought him back to the school and actually handcuffed him to a chair in the principal's office. And so he was handcuffed to the chair when the mother got there. And when she walked in, I didn't really know what to expect. I had not ever met her before, but she walked in, and as she walked up to him, I guess I was expecting her to say, I'm disappointed in you, or, what were you thinking when you did this or that? And instead, she just began pounding that child, just beating him mercilessly. In front of the two police officers were there, the principal, the assistant principal, a couple of us from special education, and the police had to actually intervene and stop her from continuing to just beat him mercilessly. So no telling what this child had endured in his very short life. He was probably only 10 or 11 at the time that I encountered him. And he didn't stand much chance. I wonder what's happened to him in the ensuing 10 or 12 years since then. He surely is, an adult by now, and, probably has a criminal record, I would, beyond that he had as an elementary student.
And
But
gangs often do look for a kid like that to recruit, because normally, even if they get caught, it's, a slap on the wrist, they're back out, and, because they're so young. So they're good targets for gangs when you can find a kid like that. Environmental causes, while we're on that, and the family issue. When I did my doctoral internship, I went to all 13 of the kid jails, the Texas Youth Commission facilities in the state of Texas. You'd be proud to know that Texas boasts the largest kid prison in the world. And we actually have 13 different ones around there's different numbers now, but at that time there were 13. And in Corsicana, the Corsicana State School is where the most emotionally disturbed, the psychiatric type kids are. Kids that they have to keep in a cell with nothing but, I call it, Tyco looking bed, a big plastic bed, with no sheets, no pillow, no nothing, because the kids will hang themselves with it, that sort of thing. Anyway, I was looking at the special ed records of these kiddos, and of all the kids that were on that unit with the most serious, 100% of them had been sexually abused as a child. So when you're a child who's abused, you see the world as the abused and the abusers. And the abusers have all the power. They're bigger, stronger, they're in control. If you're the abused, you have no power. You are weak, you are subject to whatever somebody else wants to do to you. So what we see often with kids who are abused is they become abusers. It's either become an abuser or continue to be abused. And there were just so many sad and sick stories that I read in these kids' folders. One of them, a kid, based on what he had been through and everything, he decided that he wanted to masturbate into the mouth of a kitten, and he held this kitten, and the kitten bit him. So he killed the kitten and then completed his objective. So there are those sorts of things happening with kids in Texas.
Things you can't even conceptualize until you hear a story like that. Things you've never even thought of, hopefully, until you hear a really depraved kind of story.
I got tons of them.
Well, yeah. And that's in the mind of children who are in our schools, that many of you will encounter when you when you get into the schools.
And
And
unlike many of the other disabilities, you can't tell by looking.
yeah,
This kid looks normal.
yeah. And the scary thing is, even those of you who are working on your child and family studies degrees and will work with the youngest of our children, our preschool populations, oftentimes in our daycares and other settings such as that, will be astonished at some of the abuse and neglect that you'll see amongst those populations.
I'm thinking back to all the kids that I've ever worked with that have emotional and behavioral disorders. And I can only think of one. Okay, two. I can only think of two who were still with the original mom and dad in their family of origin. You know, is it a case where the family falling apart causes the kid to develop an emotional or behavior disorder? Or is it a situation where the emotional behavior disorder puts so much stress on the family that they can't stay together?
Yeah.
So it can be either or both of those things working together, but it's highly likely if you meet a kid that has an emotional or behavior disorder that he does not have his original parents in the home anymore.
Yeah. The next bullet talks about genetic causes, and it could be something as significant as schizophrenia, which does run in families. If you're interested in the topic of schizophrenia, there was a fascinating book that was written a couple of years ago called Hidden Valley Road, I believe is the name of it, about a family. It's a true account of a family in Colorado. The father worked for the Air Force Academy, and I believe they had 10 or 12 children, and an astonishing number of those children, they had all boys except for 2 girls. I think they had 12 kids. I think they had 10 sons and 2 daughters. And like 6 or 7 of the children in that family developed schizophrenia. And as such, they have contributed a lot of data to the studies that have been done on schizophrenia as a genetic marker. And there's been a lot of research done on this topic, and it's very definitely a genetic link there with schizophrenia, and it does run in families. So if you meet a person who has schizophrenia, there is a genetic link somewhere in the family. Anxiety and depression also have some genetic links, not nearly as clearly defined as that genetic marker that comes with schizophrenia. But you probably have just seen this anecdotally in people that you know, maybe in your own family, where there may be anxiety or depression or other kinds of issues like that with family members, that those kinds of issues do oftentimes run in families as well. And then we have the issue of combined causes. It may be a combination of some sort of genetic propensity toward emotional or behavioral issues, combined with some environmental causes that kind of maybe push somebody over that brink if they were inclined that way to start with.
And a lot of times you see that where there is a genetic issue going on, but the family doesn't know how to teach the kid how to cope with it. And that goes back to the high poverty level, which usually is a result of lack of education. And so there's just a vicious cycle that sets up. While we're got schizophrenia up there, television has led us astray on schizophrenia. What we normally think of as schizophrenia is actually multiple personality disorder, where you think somebody has multiple personalities. That's not necessarily schizophrenia. Schizophrenia
is not schizophrenia.
That is not schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is when you break the touch between reality and whatever's going on in your head. So it's a losing touch with reality, basically. I had another girl in class, paranoid schizophrenic, and brilliant girl. She had an IQ like 116, 117, something like that. So more than one standard deviation above the norm. Really intelligent girl, but had schizophrenia. And I remember coming in, I'd gone down the hall for something, came back into my classroom. Now, I had other adults in my classroom. I'd never leave these kids alone. And I had one of those rolling chalkboards, you know, back in the day when we had chalkboards. And she had climbed up on top of that rolling chalkboard somehow and was perched on top of that when I came back into the classroom. And I had to basically pull her down from that. And then she had a pencil in her hand and she started trying to, you know, jab me with it. And I ended up pushing her against the cabinet and putting my weight against her in order to get the pencil out of her hand so she'd stop trying to stab me or hurt herself with it. And then it happened to be a day that we were taking the kids out on a field trip. We went to take the kids on the field trip. She ran off. We had no idea where she had gone. And the crazy thing was my principal, we'd got a new principal that year. And I said, I want to tell you about my program. And he says, oh, I know all about BIC classes and all that. You don't have to tell me. And I was like,
What does BIC stand for?
BIC is a behavior improvement classroom. And I said, now we're way beyond that. This is called a day treatment classroom. And we've got the kids that have been kicked out of BIC. Sometimes they call them back behavior adjustment classrooms. Sometimes they have fancy names for them like success or, you know, other things like that. So later on, we came back, we never could find the girls. So we thought, well, we're going to have to get the other kids back to school. We got back to school and my principal comes down there and he says, well, this girl's mother is on the phone and she says that something happened in the classroom and that you slammed her kid against the wall and choked her. And I said, well, no, I didn't choke her. I did push her against the wall to, you know, take the pencil she's trying to stab us with. And he said, well, the weird thing is the mom said you threw her against the cabinet and choked her, but that was probably appropriate. The mom had seen these types of behaviors from her and the principal was just flipped out about it. Well, it turns out the girl had walked away from where our field trip was to an office building that her sister worked in that she recognized. So it was a big mess, but it all stemmed from that paranoid schizophrenia where for some reason she thought she needed to climb that chalkboard that day.
Goodness. Okay, we've talked a little bit already about the identification process, that it has to be conducted by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But how do they identify it? Well, they do so with several tools that they have in their little arsenal. They can do it beginning with observation. They usually do an observation where the student is unaware that they're being observed. So they will watch them in a classroom or in the lunchroom or on the playground or in gym class or wherever they can be unobtrusive in that observation. And then they have behavior rating scales that they'll hand to the parent or caregiver or teachers or other people that spend time with that student and get them to rate the student in the way that they react to stimuli, to a variety of things.
And if you're a teacher and you're asked to rate one of those, they'll give you a sheet and it usually has this child does this to a greater degree than other students. So you're kind of comparing them against their peers. You don't have to be an expert. You just tell them what you've seen.
Yeah, but you always need to be very, very honest because what you say counts for a lot in making the determination of whether or not an emotional disorder exists. Then they may take the student aside and do some personality inventories. Those are usually true false kinds of things. You know, do you, what, I don't know, I can't even think of an example. Does the sky look blue when you look at it? And they would say yes or no, true or false.
I would rather be alone than with others.
Yeah.
True or false.
I've I want to hurt my cat, or something like that, you know. Um, and then projective tests. These are things like the Rorschach ink blot test that you've all seen and heard about as you've been growing up. A draw a person test where they're asked to just draw a person of any type on a piece of blank paper, and then an analysis is done of that to see how many abnormal qualities they may add to it. Have anything you want to add here?
Sometimes it's family. You draw your family, and sometimes you'll see these kids draw themselves as tiny, showing that they don't feel they're significant and that kind of thing. But a projective test is just that you look at what they've done and then you try to project what that means. Some people think it's kind of soft science, but you can, if you've seen enough of them, you can learn something from them.
So the next part here is something that your book spends some time on, and that is how do we actually instruct students who have emotional and or behavioral disorders. I think I'm going to let the other Dr. Cavan talk about this. There's a link here at the bottom to a social skills training. It's a little cartoon that talks about social skills training, but I'm just going to let you talk about some of these because this is more in your wheelhouse.
Yeah. So most of us who work with kids with emotional behavior disorders believe that they need to be taught how to behave. And sometimes you will hear people say, well, that's the family's job. Okay, maybe it was the family's job, but whatever, it didn't happen. So now it's your problem if you work at the school. So let's stop just saying it's their problem and let's fix it. So just like you use direct instruction to teach a child how to use the Pythagorean theorem, you use direct instruction to teach them how to raise their hand and get permission for something. One thing that I talk about is many teachers, when they get a kid in the room, they'll say, well, this kid doesn't even know. This kid doesn't even know how to raise his hand and sharpen the pencil, ask to sharpen the pencil. Well, there's no national policy on pencil sharpening. And if I'm in a room teaching teachers this, I will say, okay, what's the policy for sharpening a pencil in your room? They don't sharpen a pencil. I have a stack of, I've got a cup full of sharpened pencils, and they put in a dull pencil in the other one, and they got to get already sharpened one. The next teacher will say, well, I can tell them as long as I'm not talking, you can get up there and sharpen your pencil, no problem. Then you get the next one. I tell them that there can be no more than 2 people in line for the sharpener. So on and on, every teacher has a different system. Well, if you're that kid and you're going to 6 different classes a day, you may have 6 different things you need to learn about how can I get my pencil sharpened in this particular class. Other teachers, I was never big on you have to raise your hand and me call on you before you can talk in my class. I wanted to have discussions with my kids and that sort of thing. So not a big deal. But in a lot of classes, that is a big deal. So there are social skills curricula out there. A couple of the big ones are Boys Town and Goldstein's Skill Streaming, and they basically work the same way. Every skill, I think, in Boys Town starts off with look at the person, and every skill in skill streaming starts off with make eye contact. So, they're just different ways of saying the same thing. But I think we've got the example in another slide or two about raising your hand. To get the teacher's attention, the skill is you look at the person, you raise your hand, you wait for acknowledgement, and then you state your request. So they do a task analysis, which is basically breaking down into steps. I've forgotten how many different social skills there are, but bunches of them. And it goes from as simple as that to, accepting a compliment or accepting consequences when you get in trouble, those sorts of things. And they have it all broken down. Our kids need to be taught that directly. You don't just, a lot of kids, sure, they'll pick it up just from watching other kids. But we typically see kids with a learning disability and kids with emotional behavior disorders may not pick it up by osmosis like, normal kids. So they need to be taught directly. They need to be given an opportunity to practice, and that can be through a role play, or I teach you the skill and then, okay, we're going to practice. So I want one of you to raise your hand and ask if you can go to the restroom. And then, some kid will raise his hand and another kid's jumping up and holding his hand like this. And you say, no, that's not how it works. You sit quietly, raise your hand. And then the kid does it right and asks to go to the restroom. And you say, no, you can't go to the restroom. Oh, well, now we're accepting no for an answer. And that's a whole nother skill. So all of this is going on in the direct teach, but then you also teach it indirectly in context. So when regular classes are going on, you're asking to see these skills happen throughout the day. So they get the direct teach where you've taught them exactly what you want. You get an opportunity to practice it in a sterile environment and then to use it in a real life situation. Because what we're wanting that to do is transfer out. I don't want to keep this kid forever. I want him to be able to go back into a normal class and be able to operate with that particular teacher. Anything else on that?
No, I don't think so. And
Okay.
I think this next slide is the last one. And there's an example of a social skills training, the steps
Yeah,
that you would take.
that's the Boys Town. Yeah.
Okay.
Behavior improvement plans. Did you want to talk about that?
No, you go ahead.
So if you have a student that behavior is an issue at school and he's a special ed student, then you have to come up with a behavior improvement plan for him. And you have positive reinforcement, you have negative reinforcement.
What's the difference?
A positive reinforcement is a reinforcer makes that behavior more likely to happen. And it can be either positive or negative. So a positive reinforcement is a child does something right. And I say, oh, good job doing that. Here's a piece of candy, right? He's more likely to do it again. A great example of a negative reinforcement comes from your son.
What are you talking about?
So when her son was pretty young, there was a teacher who was in the news a lot because she had had sex with a student, Mary Kay Letourneau, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And her son, being a fourth grader, I believe it was, at school, a teacher was walking up and down the aisle taking care of the kids, and she reached over and put her arm around the kid and patted him. And her son says, "Ooh, Mary Kay Letourneau." Well, the teacher was horrified, and all the kids laughed.
The ones who got it and realized who Mary Kay Letourneau was, that she was the teacher in the news who had a relationship with a student.
And so she tried to convince her son of what a horrible thing he had done, and said, "No, you're not going to do that again, are you?" And he said, "Yeah." And she said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, they all laughed." So it was very reinforcing to him, even though it was a negative thing, it reinforced it. Now, the opposite of reinforcement is a punisher. That makes something less likely to happen. And sometimes that is what we traditionally think of as a punishment, but a punisher can be just ignoring somebody. I use planned ignoring all the time, where I know what you're saying, but we've already been through that, so I'm not even going to acknowledge that.
He uses planned ignoring with me too, when he doesn't like what I'm suggesting.
Sometimes it works. Yeah. You can do behavior contracts, which are basically you write it out with the student. You have them help you. This is a behavior, and you always want to do this in a positive. This is behavior we want to work on. So instead of saying, I'm not going to yell out without permission, you would state it in the positive. I'm going to get permission before talking, that kind of thing. The token economy, with little kids, you can use actual tokens where, if you do good, I'm going to give you a token, and then you can trade those tokens for things. When your kids get older, you use what we call a semi-token economy, and that's a point-based system. Boys Town is big into that. And that's one thing that we had going with kids that I'm working with right now. They earn points for doing their work. They lose points for not using their social skills appropriately. But then they can earn those points back. The reason that the point-based semi-token economy is good is because you can change up your rewards. You basically have a menu. And you might have whatever little Debbie snacks are on sale at Walmart this week. Plus I've got some monkey noodles, and I've got other things that he can buy with his points, things that I know he likes. And he will try to earn points in order to buy those things.
And a lot of general ed teachers use things like that too, don't they? I mean,
Sure.
you don't have to be a special ed classroom or working with a child with a serious disability to use a semi-token economy. A lot of general ed teachers have a treasure box that kids can earn points to get into the treasure box.
Yeah, and one of the things I always say is that good teaching is good teaching. If you have a kid who doesn't really know how to do things in your classroom, when I do an instruction for new teachers, I don't care, even when I was a principal, I don't care if you don't get any academics done the first week. You establish your procedures, you teach them directly. This is how you sharpen your pencil in my classroom. This is the procedure for passing up papers. Do we hand them across the aisle? Do we pass them up? Does everybody take them up and put them into a folder? Do we wait for the teacher to call? It's done a jillion different ways. And if the kid doesn't know, then every period is different. So I want my teachers teaching those things so the kids know what the procedures are. When I come into the classroom, what's the expectation? Well, I've got work on the board when you walk in. The expectation is that you're already working before the bell rings, and that we're going to work until the bell rings. We work bell to bell. Those are the expectations. So if you don't teach those expectations, don't expect them.
Good. Okay. And then, like I said, that last slide is just an example of social skills training. This link here on the second to the last slide is a little video of that. And here, social skills are taught directly, practiced, taught, and used in context, which Clark just referenced a few minutes ago. And you must be consistent. And I think
right, consistency is so important because they don't get it anywhere else.
Yeah.
Mom will say yes to this today, and tomorrow we'll slap you across the face for asking. We've got parents that are working 2 or 3 jobs. They're single moms trying to keep these kids and still make a living and try to have a life of their own.
With very challenging kids.
A lot of these home situations would just make you cry. Friday, kid that I was working with, the last I saw him, he was in the back seat of a police cruiser headed to a psychiatric hospital. I mean, that's where mom was with this kid, that the same kid that hit me with the chair. He's currently in a psych ward. So you, as the teacher, need to be consistent. You need to make sure that you have your expectations, your procedures, have all that in place, and be consistent with the implementation.
And that does it for our PowerPoint and for our discussion tonight. Does anybody on the screen have any questions or comments before we close out?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
I'm all good.
Okay, then we'll say goodnight for this evening and thank you all for attending.
I would say, don't let me scare you. These kids are not what you're normally going to be working with. And if you do, you need to make sure that you're getting the training that you need. There's training that you have to have if you're going to physically restrain a kid or anything like that. But don't go in scared. I know that when I've talked about this before, sometimes I've scared people out there. I'm not going to be a teacher if that's what I'm up against. This is,
It's
2%.
Yeah, it's a rarity. Yeah. Okay, well then we'll say goodnight and thank y'all for attending and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for being here.
Bye, y'all.